So, I've been playing a game called Triangle Strategy, and having finished the game now, I'm not really sure that they should have called it Triangle Strategy. Like, I just don't know how it sells the game or, like, alludes to its themes or messages. Like, I get it. It's the same guys that did Bravely Default and Octopath Traveler, but even then, I think Triangle Strategy's title sits on another level when it comes to just being dull and undescriptive. But anyway, it is a good game that I think you should play, especially if you like turn-based tactics RPGs, and especially if you have a soft spot for political machinations and schemes and plots and subterfuge. This isn't going to be a review of the game though, I want to just talk about one mechanic, the scales of conviction. Now, not only do I think it mechanically adds to the narrative within the game itself, but as a concept, I was drawn to the potentials of it in terms of commenting on democracy more broadly. Before we get to all of that, however, the scales of conviction are almost intrinsically linked to how the game progresses, so I will have to lay down some groundwork and also let you know that there will be plenty of spoilers, and especially for some of that aforementioned subterfuge and plotting. The game opens with a summary of the history of this region. It has three major factions, Esfrost, Glenbrook, and Hyzant. Each of them play a specific role within the ecosystem owing to their locations bestowing almost monopolistic control of resources. Glenbrook, and by extension House Wolfort, are essentially the breadbasket, with a nice river for trade. Esfrost have most of the iron, and Hyzant hold an actual monopoly on the region's salt, which the game frames as necessary for survival. This antagonism of resources engulfed the world in a massive conflict called the Salt-Iron War. The game proper starts after that event during a time of peace, and we follow the younger royals of House Wolfort as they begin to navigate their role in this world and take positions of power themselves. The wounds from the Salt-Iron War have yet to heal, and a joint project between the three nations serves as an opportunity to prolong the peace. But really, given how interesting peace is, the majority of the game's time is spent in what is essentially the Salt-Iron War 2. The game takes a good while to get going. You spend a lot of time watching scenes play out, being introduced to characters, and listening to narration that explains the context of what is going on.
One after another, dignitaries from each nation arrive in Glenbrook to solidify this accord and toast to its success, the first step on the road to peace.
Outside of the first tutorial fight, I think it's like a solid hour of watching people talk before there's another battle. So for many players, this will be pretty annoying, especially if you're just here to do turn-based combat stuff. However, you can't necessarily cut any of this stuff out because much of it is kind of necessary for understanding the choices that you'll need to make in the future. How you come to make the choices you make in Triangle Strategy is where things get interesting and diverge from typical video game fare. The Scales of Conviction within the game's lore is a relic used by the Wolforts. It is a scale, as the name would imply, and it comes with 7 tokens. The conceit is that it is used to decide what to do as a collective. The tokens are given to the 7 main characters of the game, and they are cast into the scales to facilitate a democratic process of decision making. So rather than just have the player choose what they want to do, each character is given an ideological position they hold, and the player who doesn't get a vote can either just let things play out, or they can go and attempt to persuade people to a different position. As an example, let's look at the first Scales of Conviction scene. It gives you a simple choice. Do you A, go visit Hyzant, or B, go visit Esfrost? So say you were paying attention to the game's lengthy opening story like a good JRPG player. You decide you want to go to Esfrost because, I don't know, you like mountains or something. You can see that Frederica, Benedict, and Gila are opposed. You just go up to them, initiate a dialogue, and you're given some choices as to the argument you can use to attempt persuasion. After that, everyone casts their vote.
Scales of Conviction will illuminate the path we've chosen.
And then, dramatic pause. Your path is decided. Alright, let's break things down. So this first choice of which kingdom to go visit might seem quite banal, but what I think is cool about it is there's no real right answer. There's no good or bad binary here. There's no easy choice, and as things progress, this paradigm remains, but naturally as conflict begins to take over the world, so do the stakes increase, the choices become harder to make, and then less banal.
Do we surrender Prince Roland, or do we protect him from those who would do him harm?
The typical attitude to choices in video games is built off of binary systems usually, good versus bad. Or if you're a modern day Bethesda game, a monary system where none of your choices really mean anything at all, and all roads lead to yes. As a stark contrast to a game like Fallout 4, Triangle Strategy uses its choices to deliberately test the things that you believe, your broader convictions, rather than simplistic morality. Looking at this mechanic, you could very well just say that it is choices, but with extra steps. And it is, but those extra steps matter. The fact that each character has an ideological position kind of forces you as a writer to flesh them out. This is linked into why the opening being so story-heavy is okay. It gives you a sense for these characters, and as such allows you insight into what kinds of arguments would be effective in swaying them to a different position. In that first example, for instance, the ever-pragmatic Benedict wants to go to Hyzant due to its famous Ministry of Medicine. And so an effective argument for getting him to go to Esfrost is to remind him of that fully sick library they have over there. Frederica, on the other hand, is betrothed to the player character Serenoa, and is way less of a massive nerd, so the much more romantic arguments are more effective against her. I was reading this review of Triangle Strategy on IGN, and whoever this person is seems to really take objection to how dull, overly polite, and reasonable all of the main characters are, and like, I kind of get that as a criticism, but I think they kind of have to be written this way. They have to be reasonable for you to convince them onto every point that you may have, but whatever. The reviewer does go on to say that the scales of conviction elevates their characters, even if they aren't, big edgelord debate bros or whatever. To me, what is evident here is that the characters may be written in a dull manner, but the use of this mechanic and the extra steps involved results in the characters becoming more fully formed, multi-dimensional beings. People with their own convictions and viewpoints that you have to engage with every time you want to persuade them of your convictions. An additional thing you get as a game designer, or I guess a game director, because we have to ape the movie industry and chase their clout as much as possible, is that it gives character to the party as a whole. In most games where you get a party, and especially those that are more gameplay focused like Fire Emblem,
3 territories, 3 houses, your very own journey.
the choices that you make are yours, and so the party feels like much more of an extension of your will rather than its own thing. In Triangle Strategy, the party is its own character, and over the course of the story, the decisions that end up getting made inform the character arc that House Wolfort goes on. On my specific playthrough, I was adamant about protecting the people, and so I would generally side with those options.
The Roselle are our people. We must shelter them even if it earns us Hyzant's ire.
In the end, though, I was not able to convince everyone to just abandon the kingdom, and so the group went with the pragmatic option. The stakes in this case were too high. We found the limit of the ideology, and so we would side with Esfrost. The whole game up to this point was a principled stand of protecting the people and indeed fighting Esfrost, but the naivety of this position at the end of the game was cast aside. The character of House Wolfort had grown. Okay, now I recognize that through the course of the game, you make many decisions, and this last one could have gone in a way that would have meant nothing was really sacrificed ideologically. And much of that last decision is actually dependent on the type of decisions that you made previously, your accumulated convictions. But I'll say that it is cool that you as a player can read into a character arc, even if some playthroughs will be flatter than others. Now, I won't go further into the endings here because I'm still playing through the game again in a New Game Plus mode, but I have a pretty good feeling that there will be plenty to analyze about that on its own, so it'll probably get its own video whenever it is that I find time to actually go through the game again and get the other endings, write the script, record the audio, and then find everything is bad, and then do that all again a couple times, and edit that, find more problems, and then get on achieving some kind of fancy thing I don't know how to do, then spend a whole day figuring out what the shit thumbnail is going to look like 5 times, and then spend a bunch of time editing it and rendering it, finding, small weird rendering errors that I have to, go in and sort of like find a fix for. But right now though, now that I'm done talking about how this system benefits the story, I want to talk about this whole democracy malarkey. Alright, let's be upfront about this. The game does not feature a democracy. Really, it has 7 elites that have the power to decide the direction of their house. It's not like the Rosellans or the citizens of House Wolfwood have a say in whether they're used as bargaining chips.
Then you think it is right to sacrifice the Roselle to save Wolfwood?
No one is saying it is right, but a decision must be made.
Or whether their houses get burned down in a strategic battle. It does, however, give off the vibe of a democracy, and I think that's enough. Implementing something more akin to our modern, quote-unquote representative electoral democracies would take away from some of the more interesting parts of the game, like the strength of character stories, the interpersonal conflicts, and also make the persuasion system much more cumbersome or perhaps completely different to how it is now. In its limited way, though, it does do some things that explore the idea of democracies in general, and I think that's pretty cool, especially since basically all games are, authoritarian power fantasies, if you really think about it. There are many criticisms of democracies at large, but I think there are only really 2 that we need to concern ourselves with here. The first is information, as it relates to the voting process. Now, generally speaking, the characters are quite reasonable, with fairly nuanced points of view that can be swayed if given the right arguments. With the current climate of mis and disinformation though in the real world, I couldn't help but perk my ears up when, in one round of Persuasion, I was able to use a piece of information for both sides of an argument. We assume that given correct data we can land at the right choices, but data in and of itself is neutral, and whether or not something is correct for a certain context can be just an interpretation. You need only look up how crime statistics for certain population groups are used, and the advent of, alternative facts, to see the value of information and truth causing a rift in political discourse. The dissemination of information is much more important for democracies than it is for other forms of governance, so I think this little inclusion of both sidesing of information pokes at that a little bit and brings to light that flaw of democracy. Later on in the game, the information gathering segments might straight up be ignored as the choices you begin to make divide upon ideological lines, and people aren't willing to budge. Information here isn't really important since it doesn't work for those that are more zealous, and so we get to the second problem, which is division and conflict. On my first playthrough of the game, I, despite my best efforts, got the Liberty ending. In this ending you end up siding with Esfrost to take down Hyzat. It is the most pragmatic option, however Roland has a massive bias against Esfrost and cannot accept the choice. The scene that plays out devolves into an old-fashioned duel to settle this conflict between characters and their convictions, and from this point on in the game, the scales are never used again. Now, as a quick aside, I would have really liked it if the game tried to make a statement here about how this division and conflict leads to the destruction of democracies. However, I don't think that the game goes far enough to warrant that reading, and the only reason I really bring this whole thing up is because it can serve as a cool example of symbolism. Kind of like that scene in Game of Thrones where the dragon burns down the throne for no reason other than to say that thrones and thus power are bad, I guess? So if Triangle Strategy wanted to make that statement about democracies falling to division and conflict, you could just have it so that the duel between Serenoa and Roland destroyed the scales of conviction. This, in my opinion, is much less cringe than the Game of Thrones ending because it feels much more organic. The conflict between the characters is already there, and it takes place in the same room, right after the use of the object, so having it destroyed in this case makes total sense. Whereas the Game of Thrones throne being melted down makes no sense within the context of the scene. It is just a thing that happens because the writers, I guess, wanted to do a symbolism. So yeah, unfortunately the game doesn't quite go that far. It's fine though, because even if it does, in this instance, bring up this polarization and division as another downside to democracies, I think the game itself, as a whole, is in favor of the concept. After all, the democratic perspective is the playable one, and all of the evil and most schemy acts are done by the authoritarian states.
There you are, fair Dragan. What a pity that your dreams of being Prime Minister shall be nothing more than that.
With Esfrost starting a war with murder, scheming, and the ambitions of one man, Hyzant basically using a fake religion as an excuse to subjugate and enslave an entire group of people, there is a distinct lack of transparency here with the autocrats. Lies and deceit are rampant in the other kingdoms, even in Glenbrook with their elite class.
The royal family entrusted House Consort with the minutiae of daily governance, and our priorities have changed.
The Wolford House, on the other hand, feel much more transparent, because even when they do something bad, at the very least, it was done through some kind of group deliberation rather than the whims of an individual. How the democratic process is handled in this game is also something I find to be quite thought-provoking. I mentioned before that there are no easy choices, no piece of data that will tell you what is correct. And so there were a few times there where I had legitimately no clue what I wanted to do. Everything was bad. So what I ended up doing here was to just talk to every member of the party and try to persuade them out of their position, just to get their arguments, and in this process, I would usually find something that convinced me one way or another. I think it is really cool for a game to have this kind of effect, to not just be a vessel for whatever opinions the player holds, but have the ability to pose positions and arguments that can alter those opinions. Adding on to the feeling of transparency, this increased value in argumentation and discourse is something that democracies allow that more authoritarian forms of governance do not, and what Triangle Strategy ends up conveying through these mechanics. I think it's quite hard to disagree with that kind of sentiment. The question with democracy, though, is whether it's worth the conflict and division that this argumentation results in. Now, I personally would say that it is, and not just because I believe in egalitarianism and that our best work is done as a collective with the safety and prosperity of the collective in mind, but because whatever decision is made, at least in principle, it was made by the most people, in whatever group you find yourself to be in. And even if you disagree with the choices that get made, there is a certain amount of solace to be found in the majority. This little side character interaction, I think, sums that aspect up, and I think goes to the heart of what this game wants to convey.
Pray tell, what brings you before me?
It is said House Wolfert possesses a relic known as the Scales of Conviction. Is this true?
It is. We turn to the scales for guidance in times of trouble.
Then, I wonder if they might guide me forward as well. I had a crisis of confidence. A man was counting on me to save his life, and I let him die. I cannot let this happen again. I wish to save all the lives I can, regardless of country or creed. Pray grant me the chance to consult the scales, that I might walk the righteous path.
The scales are merely a tool to an end. They are not a magical window into the future. When decisions must be made, all in this house have a say. We choose as best we're able and strive to ensure we chose wisely.
You mean you strive not to regret your decision?
That is all one can do. Forgive me if this is not the answer you sought.
When I was first exposed to this game, it was Project Triangle Strategy, and I was of course drawn into the beautiful faux 16-bit but 3D art style, but was also much more excited by playing this aesthetic around a strategic turn-based core. As it got closer to release, the game's title would remain, a somewhat worrying sign that there was not going to be much substance to this game, but here we are, and though the title is still brain-numbingly undescriptive, the game itself ends up being rather expressive. Through the mechanic of the Scales of Conviction, you play as a tiny little democracy, one that is brimming with character despite their excruciating politeness and rationality. When you are thrust into the world and don't know what the other factions are doing or planning, and as things get worse and worse, it can be hard to know whether you did the right thing. At the end of the day, though, the choices you make are not made alone, and there is a tremendous amount of solace that can be found there. Out in the world, there are people who decry the tyranny of the majority, but the alternative is always a tyranny of the few, and it would seem that Triangle Strategy sides with the former. Yay, now we can get on to rampant theory crafting. Okay, so I'm going to apologize in advance. This is not going to be very production heavy, but if you stick around and I guess just listen to me or whatever, I will explain, or I'll attempt to explain, where you can take a mechanic like this and I guess in some ways further bring out the intricacies of a democratic process. Now, I thought I'd have more than just 2 ideas, but it's kind of hard to figure out how some of the more negative stuff of democracies can work when you bring them in and make them fun in terms of gameplay. Stuff like voter ignorance and elite capture, I don't really know how to handle on a gameplay front, but maybe another time we'll make another video about that. Anyway, the 2 ideas I have basically involve expanding the party system and who gets a vote and what they are willing to vote for. Now, this will map fairly well to what is already part of this kind of game. So if we take Triangle Strategy and its 7 party members getting a vote as a base, we can change it so that every party member that you gets a vote. And I think you can do some pretty cool things with this idea. Now, one of the issues with democracy is how it seems to slide very easily towards fascism, which I don't necessarily know is a failure of democracies, more than it is of human nature and how we interact with power structures in general, but whatever, we'll let the debate bros handle that. You could convey this slide out of democracy by expanding who gets a vote. The initial party might be quite balanced, but that might change given the new characters that rock up and whatever convictions they might hold. If all of a sudden things aren't going your way as the player, you may find yourself being very selective about who makes it into the party in the first place. All kinds of electoral and representative issues can then be explored, like whether you yourself diligently impose some kind of quota or other such mechanism to keep things equal, or you can just let things go and create your own little echo chamber. This would not only have the benefit of reflecting some of the issues we have now, but it would also make for interesting decision making and flow-on effects that would affect gameplay. For instance, you can imagine a system where certain classes would naturally lean towards certain convictions. Healers might be more moral, warriors more attuned to liberty, and perhaps strategists being more on the side of utility. Now, what this would mean is that stacking the deck, though giving you more control over the choices that get made, would end up giving you an unbalanced squad and make combat encounters more challenging. This could further be expanded in perhaps the retention of units as well. In Triangle Strategy, units you get basically stay forever. But the rift between Serenoa and Roland, I think, can be expanded. Having too much division and polarization might make certain party members leave, or perhaps have a number of them revolt and force an unwanted combat scene, or maybe join the enemy or something like that. On its own, I think that's a pretty cool idea, but you could expand things more by having this whole system where units have certain requirements that keep them in your party. One of the so-called benefits of democracies is that the elites have to keep you happy in order for you to stay on their side, right? So imagine if the merchant that you get in Triangle Strategy relied upon having a certain amount of money. And say a certain healer or, child characters or whatever wanted you to spend money on certain items. As a player, you would have all of these extra things to think about in terms of how you play and how to appease certain characters to keep whatever direction you want the game to go in intact. There's heaps of ways you could do this too that could be reflective of life and tie in other systems. Healers, for instance, might want to keep kills low in combat. Warriors might want to have more warriors in the party and they might like killing people, I don't know, something like that. Every facet of the game could be linked into this system and it would make conveying additional nuances of modern democracies much more viable, but also increase the decision making that the player goes through. Now, these might end up being frustrating from a purely gameplay perspective to have things not go your way, but I think it is possible to thread the needle to gain all the benefits without sacrificing too much in terms of player experience. Anyway, that's what I reckon would be cool for a game to do, doing a democracy thing. Anyway, I hope any of what I said made any sense at all. Anyway, if you've made it this far, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. Oh, if you have any cool ideas, gameplay-wise, that could do a democracy, put them in the comments. I'd love to read them. But yeah, see you later.